You wake up and you already feel it, that invisible weight on your chest, that small whisper in your head saying, "Not now, maybe later." You scroll your phone, you tell yourself you need to rest before you start. You watch another video, and somehow the morning slips away. This quiet, slow slide into stillness is what many call laziness. But William James saw it as something deeper. Not a flaw in willpower, but a battle of attention and energy, a tug between what he called the automatic self and the conscious chooser. It is not that we lack energy, it is that our energy is trapped in habits and thoughts that no longer serve us, and yet our mind clings to them because it fears the effort of change. Laziness, he said, is not a moral failure. It is a misdirection of consciousness. When your inner compass spins and you no longer trust what matters, you freeze and call it tiredness. But beneath that stillness, there is a war between the self that wants to grow and the self that wants to stay safe. This is the psychology of laziness, a condition not of the body but of the divided soul. Every time you feel that heavy resistance before starting your work, before sending that message, before standing up to take care of yourself, what you are really feeling is the weight of an unmade decision. The mind tries to escape it by doing nothing, thinking that rest will dissolve it. But true rest never comes because you are not tired from effort. You are tired from avoidance. James believed that consciousness is like a spotlight. It cannot light up everything at once, so when we allow our focus to scatter, the spotlight dims and the world feels grey. Every small task becomes heavy. Every movement feels slow. Not because we are weak, but because our inner light has spread too thin. He wrote about the will as a muscle that must be trained by small acts of choice, each act reminding the body that it can move the world, that it still matters. Laziness is not the absence of movement. It is the absence of meaningful direction. Picture a young woman sitting before her laptop, the screen blank. She wants to write. She believes she has something worth saying, but her hands rest still. She feels a quiet panic underneath her calm because every word she writes might reveal something she is not ready to face. So she opens another tab, then another. Her will begins to leak into distraction. This is not laziness, this is fear, disguised as stillness, the fear of being seen, of failing, of changing the shape of her identity. Another moment, a man comes home from work. His shoes stay by the door, the dishes pile up. He sits staring at the wall. Not because he does not care, but because caring has become too expensive. His mind replays old loops. His energy fades before it begins. He calls it exhaustion, but in truth he is mourning his own direction. He has lived too long in the service of others' expectations, and now his will has grown quiet, like a fire deprived of oxygen. William James would say this is the moment the self must act, not in a burst of motivation, but in the smallest deliberate step. He taught that we change not by grand decisions, but by the next choice that redirects our attention. You do not wait for energy. You generate it by acting before you feel ready tonight. If you feel that fog when you know you should move instead of forcing a giant leap, write one sentence beginning with, "I am choosing to," and finish it. However honestly you can, that small line will break the spell. It gives your mind a direction. And once direction returns, energy follows. Laziness begins to dissolve when attention finds a purpose. It is not about speed or discipline. It is about alignment between what you think and what you value. When you act from that alignment, motion becomes natural again and your energy becomes clean. William James predicted that the mind of the future would struggle not from physical tiredness, but from too many choices, too many distractions, too many directions. Without meaning, maybe this is that future. Maybe the cure is not more pressure, but more presence to begin again, to care just enough to move. Once. The strange thing about laziness is that it never begins as laziness. It begins as hesitation. A thin pause between thought and action. A moment where the mind negotiates with itself, promising to begin later when it feels clearer or calmer. That pause stretches and soon becomes a habit. The body forgets the rhythm of doing, the spirit forgets the taste of motion. William James saw this not as a sin but as a signal. He believed that every act of will begins with an idea held in the mind long enough to make the body move. But in modern life, the idea rarely survives that long because we drown It in constant noise when every notification competes for your mind's light. Even the smallest intention flickers out before it becomes real. He wrote about the divided self, the part of us that observes and the part that acts. One wants order. The other wants safety. And when these two fall out of harmony, you feel paralyzed. It feels like laziness, but it is really confusion. You are trying to live two stories at once, one that seeks meaning and one that fears disruption. You cannot step forward, while half of you clings to the past, so the body sits still pretending to rest, but inside there is friction. The longer you stay in that state, the heavier it becomes because unexpressed energy turns into tension. Every undone task becomes a shadow, following you quietly asking, when will you live? Imagine a college student staring at his assignments. He knows the deadline is near, but his thoughts are scattered like leaves. He opens the window, scrolls through his phone, makes tea. He calls it procrastination. But it is actually indecision about who he wants to be. The work in front of him demands effort but also identity. To do it means to declare something about himself, and sometimes that declaration feels too final. So he waits thinking the right mood will come yet. The longer he waits, the harder it is to begin because waiting becomes its own identity. He does not see that action. Itself creates clarity. William James would have called this a moral crisis, not in the sense of good or bad, but in the sense of direction and meaning. He believed that consciousness is shaped by choice, and that choice grows dull when we stop practicing it. He taught that every day we should make at least one deliberate act that resists inertia, even if it is small. He used to say that when the will hesitates, the best cure is movement before thought. Not careless movement, but chosen movement. So if you feel that thick silence of resistance, you can start by standing up, walking to the window, breathing deeply, and naming what you see. This simple act returns you to presence. It reclaims attention from imagination and grounds it in reality. Another young woman once told a story of how she could not get out of bed for weeks. She thought she was lazy, but what she really was missing was a sense of belonging. Every action felt meaningless because she had no clear image of where her effort would land. She began by lighting a candle each morning, not to work, but just to remind herself she could create a small light. Her mind started to follow the flame. Her attention grew steadier and soon her will returned. James would have loved that, because he saw attention as the root of all willpower. The moment you learn to hold your focus gently on one thing, the fog begins to lift. He predicted that in the future, laziness would become a cultural disease born not of weakness, but of overstimulation. He saw that the human brain would be asked to respond to too many signals at once, that the spirit would tire from constant noise. So he wrote that salvation lies in selective attention. To choose what deserves your consciousness is to reclaim your freedom. So perhaps when you next call yourself lazy, what you really mean is, I have forgotten where to place my light. Once you remember that the smallest choice becomes sacred, the hand moves, the eyes awaken, the stillness opens into life again. There is something deeply human about our struggle with effort. Every generation imagines that laziness is a modern problem, but William James already saw its roots long ago. He noticed how the mind is built for economy, always seeking the path of least resistance, because survival once depended on conserving energy, but in an age where survival no longer demands constant motion, that same instinct becomes our cage. We do not rest because we are fulfilled. We rest because our instincts confuse stillness with safety. The nervous system whispers that doing nothing protects us, but the soul begins to ache because it knows it was not made merely to survive. It was made to express, to create, to contribute to something larger than itself. And when that longing has no outlet, the result is that quiet, dull heaviness we call laziness. James said that habits are the invisible architecture of life. They are the rails upon which our energy flows, and when those rails are poorly built, our will keeps derailing again and again. It is not enough to want change. We must build new paths for the will to travel. He believed that repetition is the mother of freedom, because once a helpful action becomes automatic, the will is freed for higher work. He gave the example of soldiers who train their reflexes until action becomes instinct, and then their courage is no longer a struggle. It is a habit in the same way when you train yourself to take one small deliberate action each morning before the excuses start. You are rewiring your inner architecture. Picture a man who has lost his job. He tells himself he will start. Looking tomorrow, he spends the day reading about motivation, yet never sends a single email. He feels guilty. He feels trapped. But what he really lacks is a bridge between thought and movement. James would tell him to shrink the task until it fits. Inside a single act of will, not the whole search. Just the first email, not the whole plan, just the first line. Because the will grows through friction, like a muscle through resistance. And when that resistance is too heavy, we stop lifting it altogether. So we must reduce the weight until movement becomes possible. The trick is not to feel ready, but to act before the inner debate begins. That is the true discipline of will. There was once a painter who could no longer pick up her brush. She called it burnout, but it was really paralysis of meaning. She had painted for approval for so long that her art became a burden. Her will collapsed under the weight of others' eyes. She began again by painting at night when no one would see her work. And slowly the colors returned, not because she forced herself, but because she reconnected to the private joy of creation. James would say that her will healed because her action rejoined her true interest. He wrote that effort is the measure of desire. When desire belongs to you, the effort feels lighter. When it belongs to someone else, the will collapses. This is why so many appear lazy, when in truth they are only exhausted from living a life that does not belong to them. To understand laziness, we must stop judging it and start listening to it. What is the part of you that refuses to move? What is it protecting you from when you pause before doing something? Notice the shape of that resistance. Is it fear of failure or fear of success? Is it doubt about your own worth or anger at being controlled? That hesitation holds information about the self. When you learn to read it, you can transform it into movement. William James would say that attention is the lever of change, that by learning where to look and how to hold that gaze, you change the inner climate of your life. So tonight before you sleep, write a single line, beginning with, "When I avoid doing it, is because," and finish it. Honestly, without editing, that small confession will show you the real cause of your stillness. Once seen, it begins to dissolve because the mind cannot unsee truth. The next morning, take one conscious breath and one conscious act. Even if it is only making your bed slowly, that act becomes a signal to the will saying, "We are alive, we are in motion again." James believed that every soul longs to feel that its actions matter, that each choice ripples into meaning, and once you taste that again, laziness becomes impossible because life begins to pull you forward instead of you having to push yourself. William James once said that most of us live habitually within a very small segment of our full consciousness, and beyond that border lies a vast reserve of untapped energy. This idea was not meant as inspiration, but as observation. He saw that the mind holds enormous potential. But fear and habit create a narrow corridor where we keep repeating the same small movements. Calling it life laziness, he believed was not the lack of energy, but the unwillingness to cross the inner border to tap into that larger self. Every time we repeat the same excuses, we reinforce the walls of that corridor until the open sky feels unreachable. But the truth is that the wall is made of thought. Alone, think about a person waking before dawn. The alarm rings, and for a moment there is silence before the decision. This is the sacred instant. James spoke of the fraction of a second where the self is free to choose either to move or to retreat. And in that single moment, the entire direction of the day is decided. If you stand the first second, your energy expands. If you hesitate, it contracts. This is not just psychology, it is physics of the inner life. Energy flows where attention goes, and when attention freezes, energy decays. He would say that the art of living begins with mastering that first moment when the will meets resistance. Many people believe motivation must come first, but James wrote that action itself produces the feeling of motivation. It is movement that awakens the spirit, because the body and the mind are not separate. The body is a declaration of choice. Every time you rise, you send a message to the deeper mind saying we are capable, and the mind in turn releases the energy needed for more movement. Imagine a man who promises himself every day that he will begin to exercise. Yet every morning he waits for the mood to strike. He keeps waiting, and months pass. The day he stops waiting and simply walks out the door without thinking. The current changes inside him. He feels tired but also alive. This is the secret rhythm that James understood, that will grows only by doing, not by thinking about doing. A young teacher once said that she used to stare at her class plans for hours, unable to begin. She called it mental laziness, but it was really a fear of inadequacy. She was haunted by the thought of being judged, so her body froze, her mind invented excuses. She would clean her desk, check her phone, even make tea, until the day she tried a different approach. She told herself, "I will plan for 5 minutes only." And after those minutes she could stop, to her surprise. 5 minutes became 30 because once movement began, the resistance dissolved. James would have said that she broke the spell of inhibition by acting within her power, rather than fighting the entire task at once. In our time, the landscape of laziness has changed. It wears new masks now. It hides in endless scrolling, in perfectionism, in the need to research before beginning. It hides in waiting for the right setup, the right inspiration, the right feeling, all of which keep us frozen while convincing us that we are preparing. James foresaw this. He believed that modern humans would face not physical exhaustion, but psychic overload, that we would drown in our own options and lose the simplicity of the next step. So he advised cultivating what he called the habit of effort, to deliberately choose small acts that strengthen the will, like brushing the mind's muscle each day. If you ever feel that suffocating heaviness of not wanting to move, try this simple act. Stand still and whisper to yourself, "I am choosing to move for 1 minute." Only then breathe and let the body respond. This is not about productivity. It is about reclaiming your will from the fog. James would say that once the will wakes even slightly, it grows stronger with use. He saw the will not as control, but as direction, not as punishment, but as the invitation of the soul to participate again. When you begin to treat laziness as a message instead of a verdict, the message becomes clear. It is not saying you are broken. It is saying you have drifted away from meaning. The cure, then, is not to push harder, but to reconnect more deeply. What action would make you feel alive, not proud, not impressive, but quietly alive? When you find that answer and follow it, energy returns like a tide, and the narrow corridor opens into sky again. The final view, William James would say, that the real victory over laziness is not endless motion, but conscious motion to move. Not because the world demands it, but because your spirit chooses it. He believed that the highest act of will is not the loud heroic push, but the quiet turning toward what matters, that moment when you choose to live by design rather than drift by default. The human heart longs for ease, but not for emptiness. It wants a life that feels earned through presence and participation. When you begin to act from this place, even ordinary tasks begin to glow. The walk to the store, the making of tea, the answering of one email, they become sacred gestures of participation in your own unfolding. Think of the woman who once could not start her work. She now lights her candle each morning and sits down not to conquer the day but to meet it. She writes one sentence, then another, until her body remembers the rhythm of creation. She does not chase motivation anymore. She trusts that action will bring it. She is living what James called the faith of effort, the belief that the smallest movement toward meaning awakens greater strength. Each time, we often imagine discipline as something cold. But for James, discipline was an act of love, love for the self that wants to grow, love for the world that needs your contribution. Laziness fades when love takes its place, because love always wants to give energy, not hoard it. This is why true willpower is not forced. It flows naturally when your actions align with what you value. When you no longer act for approval but for aliveness, then motion becomes effortless and the days stop feeling heavy. He taught that life expands in proportion to the courage you bring to it. The more you dare to act even imperfectly, the more life responds with energy, meaning, and momentum. So the next time you feel that fog creeping in, do not fight it with guilt. Sit with it, listen to it, then stand and take one conscious step forward. That single act breaks the spell every time. The cure for laziness is not more pressure. It is more presence, to live as if each act were a dialogue with your own becoming, to remember that the will is sacred. because it is the bridge between. Thought and creation. Every day you cross it. You grow more real, more awake, more whole. And in that quiet strength you find peace. So as you finish listening, take one breath and one thought of what matters most, and let that thought become motion. Write. One word, take one step. Make one call, begin again, because movement itself is grace. And within it the sleeping parts of you will finally awaken. The end.